Schmid of the Netherlands. Professor Alex Schmid is the director of the Terrorism Research Initiative, TRI, an international network of scholars who seek to enhance human security through collaborative research. He's also editor of TRI's online journal, Perspectives on Terrorism. Until 2009, he was director of the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, where he held a chair in international relations. From 1999 to 2005, he was officer in charge of the Terrorism Prevention Branch at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. And in 2010-11, he was a fellow in residence at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences. His latest publication, the Routledge Handbook of Terrorism Research, of which he is the editor and principal author. Professor Schmid.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your words. It's a pleasure to be back in Herzliya, and I wish to thank Prof. Ganor and the other organizers for inviting me again. I was last here 5 years ago speaking on elements of a successful counter-terrorism strategy. Today, I want to talk about the problem of radicalization in Western diasporas. Research is still fragmentary on this, and I will try to synthesize some of it in 20 PowerPoints. Diasporas, as many of you know, are ethnic and religious minority groups of people who, due to voluntary or involuntary migration, live in a host country but retain a close relationship with their homeland. In other words, they often have, its members have, a divided loyalty, for instance, to a secular Western host country, but also to a non-democratic, non-Western belief system which does not accept the separation of state and religion, popular sovereignty in the form of democracy, or the equality of men and women. Members of diasporas often live not only in the present but also are nostalgic for some past. Many of them dream of returning to their home country in some undefined future, seeing their stay abroad as temporary and often involuntary. Some of the migrants accept the new situation and fully assimilate to the new societies. Others integrate in the host society while preserving at the same time parts of their previous identity, making compromises in their lifestyles to the habits prevailing in the host country. Yet others, usually a very small minority within the immigrant minority group, strongly reject the host society and their place in it and long for some transformation from an uncomfortable situation. It's among this last group in diasporas that we have seen radicalization and, in some cases, the adoption of an extremist ideology advocating terrorism. While radicalization is not an exclusive diaspora phenomenon, ethnic, national, and religious diasporas have provided or hosted a substantial number of terrorists due to some typical characteristics of Western diasporas, such as freedom of expression and greater freedom of association in their country of origin. What happens in the country of origin is to some of them more important than what happens in the host country. The host country, for some of them, only serves as a safe haven from which they plan operations against the government of the home country or a third country, which might be the home country, the host country, as we have seen in Europe in the attacks of Madrid in 2004 and London in 2005. Diasporas are basically, radicals in diasporas are basically driven either by, in our case, Europe-specific grievances, motivations, or by events that occur in their country back home, or what occurs in that imagined community of the global Ummah, in the case of Muslim diaspora radicals. The literature on radicalization is quite young. Most of the things have been published in the last 6 years. This focus on radicalization, trying to activate this. This focus on radicalization is welcome since it is part of the search for root causes of terrorism. Politicians, as you can see, have come up with a great deal of alleged causes, mainly on a macro level. I remember 10 years ago in October 2001, for a week, we had 170 speakers in a General Assembly talking about what had caused 9/11. And the explanations given say more on the speakers and the countries they come from than on the phenomenon of terrorism in itself. And few, if any, of these explanations have been empirically tested. Academic researchers have also come up with causes. In my handbook, I found about 50 different theories. If you want to dignify some of the statements as theories, many of them also not tested. Some of them are overlapping with politicians' theory, and some of them are a bit closer to the mark. I think the last three have some interesting elements in it. Peter Neumann, the director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization in London, recently said, following the attacks on the United States of 11 September 2001, it suddenly became very difficult to talk about the roots of terrorism, which some commentators claimed was an effort to excuse and justify the killing of innocent civilians. It was through the notion of radicalization that a discussion became possible again. The drawback of such a bow to political correctness, however, has been that the focus on the micro level of the vulnerable individual has prevailed a bit too much. One has to look at the group which offers the promise of adventure, comradeship within a brotherhood, not just on the individual lone wolf type, self-recruited radical. And one also has to look at the macro level of analysis, how members of minorities caught between the two cultures sometimes opt for this strategy. Each of these levels of analysis can contribute something to an answer that we are seeking. There is no single cause, but a complex of factors. Yet, radicalization to what? What do we actually mean by radicalization? The concept is not as clear as many assume. Like terrorism, perhaps to a lesser degree, radicalization is not a concept we all agree on. For one thing, we are not all equally moderate to have the same reference point. The term radicalization is linked to radicalism, which, at least in the European political party history, 19th century mainly, has a progressive, positive name. Radicals were people who wanted for one vote for all, not just those who had a lot of property. Radicals were those who also wanted to give the women the vote. There's now an unfortunate tendency to equate radicalism with extremism and both with terrorism. However, these are, in my view, different, though to some extent overlapping concepts. Extremism and radicalism both can be defined in a relation to mainstream moderate political attitudes and behavior, at least in the context of democratic societies. Extremism, however, is a different animal, anti-constitutional, anti-democratic, anti-pluralist, anti-egalitarian when it comes to male and females, authoritarian, fanatic, preferring violence over persuasion, collective goals over individual goals, orders over dialogue. Now, how do we define a radicalization? Unfortunately, there are dozens of different definitions on the market. Here, three associated with Denmark, the Netherlands, and the United States in the first two cases from the intelligence services. As you can see, one defines it in terms of undemocratic violent means, the other in terms of changes in society, the third in terms of adopting an extremist belief. So here we have already three different directions of the radicalization process. Some answer the question, radicalizations towards what? Towards violent extremism, others which towards political violence, and yet others which towards terrorism. I will briefly explore these concepts, especially terrorism. I would argue that terrorism is a special subcategory of political violence, like war crimes are a special subcategory of acts of war. I have made in the past several attempts to differentiate terrorism from other forms of political violence and more legitimate uses of armed force. First, when I was a consultant to the UN before I joined it, I was asked to find some solution to the quagmire of definitions, and I thought, after studying many of them, in the latest handbook I have 260 of them cited, that perhaps we should take an existing definition on which we have already international consensus and then stretching it a little. So I advocated that we take the definition of war crimes, which you find here from the Geneva and Hague Conventions, and basically extend it to peacetime so that acts of terrorism should be defined as peacetime equivalents of war crimes. There is, in my view, great overlap. However, the international community of states was not very favorable to my approach. Only the Supreme Court of India was sympathetic and actually used it. What the UN itself, in its ad hoc committee on terrorism, which started its work in 1972 and with big interruptions continues to this day, came up in draft Article 2, is, in my view, a very broad and not a satisfactory person. Any person can be the target, including the military, any means, any act. So it is a very, very vague definition. In my view, the focus should be, and here I follow Boaz Gonor, who has some years ago persuasively argued in this direction, that we should focus basically on deliberate attacks of civilians and outlaw these. I have tried 3 times to come up, after failing to persuade the international community of states, at least try to get some consensus within the academic community. And after 3 rounds of consultations with some 200 experts, academics, and also practitioners, I came up with this revised academic draft definition, which looks at the dual character of terrorism as a doctrine on the one hand and as a practice or tactic on the other, where the targeting of civilians and non-combatants performed for its propagandistic and psychological effects on various audiences and conflict parties stays central. I would argue that what we need is a narrow international definition, legal definition. Progress in the definition debate can only be made if we differentiate terrorism from a broader spectrum of violence, political violence that are sometimes worse, sometimes less bad than terrorism. We may clearly have to make a difference between acceptable political activism, some of it illegal, even in democracies, and acts which are or should be morally unacceptable for all, whether under a democracy or other country, other regimes. So the question that we really have to ask ourselves, why do some radicals opt for this strategy, even when the opposing party uses no norm-violating forms of coercive violence to defend or advance its interests? The norms I refer to are the rule of law, human rights, humanitarian law, and democracy with respect for minority rights. And let me now give you a brief overview of radicalization research, which is often concentrating on Islamist radicalism and radicalization. What we know about radicalization towards terrorism, I have tried to summarize in these 7 points. Unfortunately, despite the extraordinary violence of terrorists, clinically, most of them, almost all, are normal. And there is no particular profile to terrorists, which is making it especially difficult for the police. And the sort of people that join these organizations can be quite different. We have ideologically motivated people and others that are just looking some sort of brotherhood. We have frustrated types, criminals who want to come clean, and so on. We also know that radicalization is usually a gradual phase process, though sometimes we hear intelligence agencies say it happens so quickly. It's probably because they come under their radar only at a late stage that these are noted so quickly. About some of these other points, since I see that time is running, I don't want to comment so much, but I would like to proceed to what we don't know, the known unknowns, where we should know more. And that the biggest question is, of course, why are so many people who are in the same situation as those who become terrorists do not become terrorists? And here the problem is that most of the research has been done by concentrating on those who became terrorists rather than the others. So we need a control group. We also know that the educated, the affluent, become terrorists often more easily than the poor and the ignorant. Terrorism is, in a way, the mode of struggle of intellectuals or semi-intellectuals who have not much regard and contact for the masses. We don't know which peoples are most vulnerable. Of course, there are groups like prison populations that are very vulnerable. We also don't know in what way religious radicalization is different from other radicalization. I think there are profound differences by people who believe in a life after life, for those of a more secular orientation. The role of the internet has been a big discussion point. Invariably, it's great, but most people have been radicalized in face-to-face contacts rather than on the internet alone. And we also have to look into the question whether some countermeasures against terrorism have not produced additional radicalization. I think there have been a number of over-responses that have made things worse. And the last question is, we have to ask ourselves, has our side not also been radicalized by the polarization brought about in the last 10 years? Certain techniques that have been introduced, like pain-induced interrogations, these illegal renditions, and so on, are questionable, and we have to watch out not to become like our enemies. Much thought has been given on counter-radicalization, which is directed about the potential constituency of the terrorists. Others have concentrated on de-radicalization. However, most people who have been terrorists and stopped being terrorists have disengaged from terrorism without really being de-radicalized. There are many reasons for disengagements, for voluntary disengagement rather than induced by some program introduced by the government. You see some of them here. Omar Ashur has looked at some of these de-radicalization processes in 3 countries and came up with the findings here. We also see that a number of tools have been identified that are useful, including the use of repentant terrorists taking an active part. This has been very useful, for instance, in Italy. So when we look at these de-radicalization programs, Israel doesn't have one as far as I know, but about 20 countries, including Saudi Arabia, have one, and they claim enormous success rates, while de-radicalizing habitual criminals is very difficult. In many countries, after 2 years, 70% of them are becoming criminals again. The de-radicalization rates, Saudi Arabia, have been fantastically high, but it all depends on what you call de-radicalization. They call it de-radicalized when they continue the jihad outside the Arab Peninsula. So the research on radicalization, de-radicalization, disengagement is an ongoing concern, and we don't have good answers for all questions. Maybe we haven't even asked the right questions. But it's important there is a dialogue between government and academia, because if these policies that are proposed and are implemented are based on wrong assumptions, we are really building policies on sand. And rigorous academic evaluation studies are necessary to prevent that taxpayers' money is wasted on expensive programs based on unknown assumptions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Schmid, and we'll entertain a couple of quick questions here. You may be seated, and you can take the questions from the microphone.